Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, or this evening if you're in London, this morning if you're joining us from New Zealand, or this afternoon in DC. Wherever you are in the world, a very, very warm welcome from us here at the DPU. My name is Shasha, which is short for Alexandra, and I'm absolutely delighted to chair today's event, which is the fourth in our post-pandemic series, which, as you may know, is a collaborative effort across the DPU, exploring and reflecting on impacts of the pandemic on the wide range of work that we do here. Today, I'm co-chairing as co-convener of our State and Market Research Group, which is a multidisciplinary group united by an interest in understanding the relationship between states and markets and the implications of that for development. This is a topic that has really been cast into sharp relief by the global pandemic, not only because we've witnessed economic policy decisions that would have been unheard of until really very recently, but also because the pandemic has really laid bare tensions and inequality in our economic system and led to sort of injected new life into discussions and thoughts about both whether our focus on financial measures of success, such as GDP, or even just evaluating the economic efficiency of decision-making, whether this is really an approach that's capable of delivering the things that really matter in life. And in this context, there's been a great deal of renewed focus on well-being approaches, with particular attention to the possibilities of well-being budgets as a way of shaping this decision-making differently. And in particular, a lot of thought and attention towards New Zealand. New Zealand is not the only country to have engaged well-being approaches in approaches to government, but it is perhaps an example of the most comprehensive and certainly one that has received a lot of attention. But there are a lot of questions that still remain that range from, at the very kind of core, what actually are well-being budgets? Who decides on the targets and how? Do they actually shape outcomes in practice? Are there conditions necessary for them to be effective? And we're really honored that today we're joined by a very distinguished speaker and discussants to help us make sense of this topic. Our speaker today is Arthur Grimes, who is a professor of wellbeing and public policy at Victoria University of Wellington's School of Government. He's also a senior fellow at the Motu Economic and Public Policy Research. He's one of the world's leading experts in wellbeing economics, but he's also has unique insights on the New Zealand policy perspective, having previously been the chairman and chief economist of the New Zealand Reserve Bank. As a discussant, we have with us Dr. George Larby, who is lead public sector governance specialist at the World Bank, someone really uniquely well placed in particular to think about how these questions apply in the development context, not only from his long career at the World Bank, but also having started in an academic context, exploring questions of the impact of governance reforms such as new public management in the global south. Before we get started, I'd like to just give you a quick sense of the structure of how we're going to, the session will be run today. Arthur's going to be speaking to us for about 30 minutes. Followed by reflections and comments by George for about 15 minutes. We'll then open up the session to questions from participants. Given the webinar format, you can actually ask questions at any point, so do feel free to go ahead and write them in the chat. But on the other hand, given the webinar format, it can be a little bit limiting because of the chat function. So we've asked two people to join us here on the panel to kick off the Q&A session. We're very lucky to have with us Adrian van Tunzelman, who has extensive experience in public policy in New Zealand, and also Professor Lian Zhang, who is the Professor of Urban Economic Development here with us at the DPU. Well, then after the Q&A session, our director here at the DPU, Michael Walls, will wrap up with some final comments and reflections. So as you can see, we've got a jam-packed agenda and what is no doubt going to be a really fascinating discussion. So without further ado, allow me to welcome and hand over to Arthur Grimes.
Thanks very much, Jojo. I'll just try and share my screen. Great. Well, good evening to you in London, and good morning from me in New Zealand. It's great to be able to be back in London, even if it's only virtually. Hopefully we'll get there later this year. So I've been asked to talk about is well-being the way forward. And this is a really important question. Obviously, as I said, well-being is one of the sort of topics of the moment in many ways for public policy throughout the world. People are thinking about how governments should be thinking about policies and budgeting for well-being, and it's particularly important in this current environment of the pandemic, and then hopefully coming out of the pandemic sometime soon. I want to start by mentioning that well-being as an approach to policy is not particularly new in my view. And I'll just start with a few approaches that have been tried in the past. And I'll start by going back 2,500 years. Confucius has a wonderful saying, there is good government when those who are near are made happy, and when those who are afar are attracted. So a good way of testing whether a government is running a well-being policy is actually seeing whether the people who are already living there, whether it's central or local government, want to stay, and whether other people want to come. So I thought that's a very nice summary of a test of a well-being approach. Shortly after Confucius, about 200 years later, Epicurus on the other side of the world, one of the great Greek philosophers, ran a school where the motto above the school gates read, "Here our highest good is pleasure." And I only wish that I'd gone to a school with that motto rather than the one I went to. And then if we go forward a few hundred, or a couple of thousand years probably, we're up to UCL territory. It only occurred to me after I prepared the presentation of this connection. And of course, Jeremy Bentham in the period of the Enlightenment, with his very famous phrase saying, "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong." So basically he's saying for public policy, we should be trying to ensure that public policy is leading to the greatest happiness of as many people as possible. And that's a phrase that's still used today in the well-being economics and well-being field. Around the same time, the same ideas were used by Mary Wollstonecraft in her great book on A Vindication of the Rights of Women, thinking about the well-being of women there. And another person who championed the rights of women a few decades later was John Stuart Mill and his wife. And in his great work on utilitarianism, he writes, "A moral agent should choose the action that maximizes the total happiness in the world." So here we have some very famous people from history. J.S. Mill, of course, one of the greatest economists of all time, talking about that policies should be trying to maximize happiness. If we go forward another couple of hundred years, we have another angle on this, which I'll refer to later, but this is a speech by Bobby Kennedy to the University of Kansas shortly before he was assassinated. And one part of it says, "Even if we act to erase material poverty, there is another greater task. It is to confront the poverty of satisfaction, purpose, and dignity that afflicts us all." So he's going beyond just straight happiness as we would normally think of it, towards purpose in life as being another aspect of well-being. By the way, if you've never read that speech, you can Google it. It's an extraordinary speech at the height of the Vietnam War. It's an amazing speech. Go forward now again, and it may surprise you if you're in the UK, this gentleman who you'll recognize, but he says, "Wealth is about so much more than pounds or euros or dollars can ever measure. It's time we admitted that there's more to life than money, and it's time we focus not just on GDP, but on GWB, general well-being." And of course, David Cameron, shortly before he was elected. And this is one of the speeches that I use when I talk to my more conservative colleagues in New Zealand, that here is a conservative Prime Minister of the UK saying that we should be focused on general well-being, not just on GDP. Shortly after that, President Sarkozy, also a centre-right politician in Europe, created the Stiglitz-Sen-Fatoussi Commission, and they emphasised there the need to supplement measures such as GDP with other measures, and they say that we should be measuring both objective and subjective well-being. So we should be having a range of measures of well-being, including subjective well-being. And of course, Stiglitz and Sen are both Nobel Prize winners in economics, and so these are not sort of faint-hearted sort of people on the fringe. Turning to New Zealand, Jojo mentioned that New Zealand had taken sort of the forefront in many ways in recent years on the well-being agenda. And the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, Jacinda Ardern and Grant Robertson, said, "This government has committed to putting the well-being of current and future generations of New Zealanders at the heart of everything we do." And importantly there, they mentioned the future generations as well. So there's a sustainability element there, which has been emphasised in this literature for some time, but sometimes gets overlooked in the talk about well-being. And I co-chair the World Wellbeing Panel with three others from the rest of the world. And the panel is a panel of experts across the range of social sciences. And it's about the promotion of well-being as the ultimate purpose of all major decision makers, particularly government. And you can Google the World Wellbeing Panel. We have a regular poll of our experts every 2 months or so on topics related to well-being. So this shows that lots of people have been talking about well-being for a long time, but what do we mean by well-being? I'm going to talk about that briefly first. Then I'll look at 2 conceptual approaches to well-being. I'll look at 6 different country experiences in terms of well-being policies, and then think a little bit more specifically about how we can use well-being as a guide for policy, guided by those concepts. So what do we mean by well-being? Well, interestingly, if you look at the shorter Oxford English Dictionary, which is the big one, despite its name, it defines well-being as the state of being or doing well in life, happy, healthy, or prosperous condition, or simply welfare. And if you turn to welfare, it says welfare is good fortune, happiness, or well-being. So well-being and welfare are really synonyms. And Arthur Pigou, the great Cambridge economist of the early 20th century, defined total welfare separately from economic welfare. He defined total welfare in almost exactly the same terms that we would define well-being today, and almost in exactly the same terms that an economist would always have defined utility as everything that makes our lives worth living and gives us pleasure in life. And so essentially the word well-being, when it comes down to it analytically, is really the same as the word welfare that we've used for a very long time in economics and policy. We talk about people's welfare and designing policies to improve people's welfare. And of course, the way that economists have defined utility in terms of a social welfare function, for instance, for economists is just a combination of people's utility. The reason why welfare, I think, has dropped out of the lexicon is because in the United States, it's generally used as a synonym for being on a benefit, and therefore has rather pejorative terms in some quarters. So well-being is not particularly a new concept. It is really a synonym for concepts that we've used for a long time. But how might we think about designing policies to improve well-being? And what conceptual basis would we use? Well, there are 2 main conceptual bases that underpin welfare approaches to public policy. One, of course, is the capabilities approach that was advanced by Amartya Sen. And Sen famously said that policy should expand the capabilities of people to lead the kinds of lives they value and have reason to value. So a very famous saying. And basically what he means is that we should be designing the opportunities and freedoms that people have so that they can then choose what they do and what they can achieve. And that's what he calls their functionings. It's a terrible word, but he defines them as functionings. This is the outcomes of what we choose to do given our capabilities, including the freedoms that society gives us, both in terms of social norms and legal strictures, etc. And Martha Nussbaum is another leading proponent of this approach. Really, SEN's approach to capabilities was just an application of what Tobin 10 years before or so had come up with when he talked about specific egalitarianism, where he talked about the role of policy being to make sure that some aspects of policy are available to everyone, and that included things like healthcare and basic education, freedoms, etc. So Tobin's specific egalitarianism really was the forerunner of SEN's capabilities approach, and of course Tobin being another Nobel Prize winner in economics. The questions about the capabilities approach is, okay, so that's very nice in terms of sounding, but who should choose which capabilities and functionings are important for policy? Clearly, we shouldn't include functionings because those are people's choices that they make out of capabilities. But which capabilities should we think are most important? Now, Martha Nussbaum takes a more strict approach than SEN. She actually sets out 10 capabilities that are required throughout the world. But if you look at those, they're quite culturally specific. SEN, on the other hand, refuses to specify which capabilities because of the cultural specificity. But he does have this rider in his saying that persons must have reason to value their chosen capabilities. But then that leads to the question, okay, who decides whether they have reason to value? This must be an external person. So it leads to quite a paternalistic sort of approach, whether one takes SEN's view that some outsider has to decide whether somebody has reason to value their capabilities, or if we have Nussbaum's approach, which could be called a maternalistic approach, I suppose, in terms of specifying which capabilities are required. So there are some drawbacks with the capabilities approach. One offshoot of the capabilities approach is which has been used for policy, is the multidimensional poverty approach, and Sabina Al-Khairi and also Foster and others have adopted this approach strongly. It basically sets thresholds for a number of indicators. These indicators may relate to capabilities, such as the proportion of of children who've gone through basic education, or it could be a threshold for a functioning in terms of the choice of transport or something like that. And what they do is they set these thresholds, and then they count the number of people that fall below a threshold, and then a person is deemed to be in multi-dimensional poverty, in other words, poverty on a number of dimensions, if they fall below, say, a third of these indicators. They might have a dirt floor, not have any transport vehicle, not have basic education, these sorts of things. And if they fall below the threshold on at least a third of the indicators, they're deemed to be in multi-dimensional poverty. And then we aim to have policies to reduce the number of people in multi-dimensional poverty. Again, I mean, in theory, in practice, this sounds great, but who chooses the indicators and the thresholds that should count? So this has to be done at a fairly local level because the particular thresholds are going to differ depending on the country is concerned. A climate, for instance, would make a difference. The approach, the capabilities approach, has been adopted quite widely. It's included in it really underpins the approach of the OECD in their Better Life Index, which is based on their House Life framework. And you can see the sort of a graphic of the OECD's House Life framework there. It has 11 different domains of current well-being, which you can read there. Interestingly, 10 of those domains relate to functionings or capabilities, and then one of those domains is subjective well-being, which is really not a domain of current well-being. It really is a summary measure of current well-being. So it's a rather jumbled approach, the OECD's approach, including subjective well-being there. And then importantly, they also bring in the sustainability element with the 4 capitals that you see down below: natural capital, the ecological capital, if you like, economic capital, the typical one considered by economists, plus human capital and social capital. And they look at things like inequalities and deprivations, which is people falling below a threshold, etc. Now, the New Zealand Treasury has adopted the OECD approach to a large extent and has their own framework, which they call the Living Standards Framework. And the current domains of well-being are in the top group there, and you'll see that 11 of them, of those 12, are identical pretty much to the OECD's domains, and then they've added cultural capability and belonging in there as well, New Zealand being a multicultural country. And at the bottom, they have pretty much the same 4 capitals underpinning current wellbeing. And in between, they've inserted a group of institutions that are important for governance and for translating, if you like, the capitals into well-being. And they also look at things through lenses of distribution and resilience and sustainability, etc. The problem with these 2 approaches really is that they're very complex. It's difficult to know how they actually lead to any kind of prioritization in the policy stream, because there are just so many things to look at that one can always pick out a policy will improve, say, leisure and play, or it'll improve engagement and voice, or something like that. How does one use a framework like this to make trade-offs which are required in a policy framework? So these are quite useful as summaries of what's going on. They're not, in my view, particularly useful as a prioritization tool for public policy. Another approach, I suppose, which is similar, are the SDGs of the UN. Again, a sort of a grab bag of 17 different areas, no prioritization, no particular, way of saying which one's more important to address than another. These sorts of approaches, these portfolio approaches, in my view, are again useful indicators, but they don't really help us to work out what we should do with policy. So the second main approach that we have is to look at subjective well-being. As I said, this is actually used in the OECD and Treasury approaches, New Zealand Treasury approaches, as one domain of well-being. But people who support this approach, which has really grown out of the Bentham and Mill sort of writings of the Enlightenment, argue that what we should do is look at the way people rate their own lives, and use that as a decentralized democratic way of thinking about what's important for well-being. And so one then designs policies to maximize this subjective well-being of the people in it, where people themselves state their own subjective well-being. And this may be weighted. It may be, unlike Bentham, where he just simply adds up utilities. We may decide that it's more, plays greater weight on the people at the bottom than at the top. And that would be the standard approach these days. When we talk about subjective well-being, we typically have 3 different measures in surveys and also conceptually. One is a longer term measure, often called life satisfaction, which we think of as evaluative well-being. You evaluate your life as a whole. And this is the measure that tends to be used most in policy settings. It's used, for instance, in the Green Book, the UK Treasury's Green Book, and in many academic writings. Happiness is more of an immediate short-term feature. The psychologists called it affect, or positive affect. They also have negative affect, which is sadness and anxiety, etc. So this is measuring sort of a point in time feeling. And again, this is now used in some studies to think about the immediate impact of certain policies, maybe particularly at the local level, which may not change somebody's overall life satisfaction, but may change their appreciation of a particular policy, say visiting a community centre or something like that. And then the third measure of subjective well-being, which is less used for policy, but is really the one that Bobby Kennedy was pointing to, is purpose in life, known as eudaimonia, Aristotle's term. And as I say, this is more of a personal sort of view, so is less likely to be used in policy senses. The advantage of these measures is that they're rated by the individual, so they're not paternalistic. We don't actually get an outsider to say what's important. We leave that up to the individual. And these are now used in policy making, as I said, in the UK Treasury's Green Book, in the New Zealand Treasury's CBA model, cost-benefit analysis model, and as recently they've been used in a tool called Wellbeing, which are like quality adjusted life years, but these are well-being years. There are 2 ways to measure this. I've got some other proponents of this approach up here, Steven Pinker and Peter Singer and Dick Easterlin, philosophers and economists. The Kantral Ladder is the one that's used in the Gallup poll. It was probably the first of these measures. And just says simply, please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. On which step of the ladder would you say you personally feel you stand at this time? And so people write down 0 up to 10. and this is a summary of their overall feeling of their life. A simpler question, which is used in general social surveys throughout the world and also in the World Value Survey, is generally worded something like, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? And these two measures give very similar answers. And just to give a sort of checking the face validity of this, what I've done is take the World Happiness Report, and if you want any summary documents on these approaches, the World Happiness Report starting in 2013 are fantastic. You can just Google them and achieve, get them, download them. And these use the Gallup poll data. Don't worry about the colors, just look at the length of the bar. And these rate the 10 highest or the 8 highest rated countries in terms of subjective well-being, average of the population, and the 8 lowest in terms of the Gallup poll. And if you look at the 8 top ones where people rate their lives very highly, they're the sort of usual candidates, I suppose, the Scandinavians, North European and New Zealand in the top 8. And the bottom 8 are places where you probably wouldn't want to live if you had a choice. So there's a strong face validity of these measures. So these are the 2 well-being approaches, the main well-being approaches, the capabilities approach and the subjective well-being approach. How have countries used these approaches in terms of policy? Well, I have a paper that's available. You'll see it referenced there at the bottom. It's a chapter in a book that was just been published from the UK, and where I look at 6 different countries' experiences with different approaches. The first of these is Bhutan. Bhutan, of course, is very famous for its gross national happiness measure. It started this in 1972, so we now have 50 years of experience with the Bhutan approach, which is actually a multidimensional poverty approach. Despite its name, it's not a gross national happiness measure. It's a multidimensional poverty approach. And the sad fact is that there have been few improvements to well-being in Bhutan over this period, certainly relative to its neighbours. So the multidimensional poverty approach is there. It's beautifully phrased, it's beautifully developed conceptually, but in practice, it hasn't led to major improvements in life in Bhutan over that time. A more recent example was Australia. The Australian Treasury developed a very nice framework, conceptually a very nice framework that was a mixture of the subjective well-being or utilitarianism approaches and the capabilities approach. What they found difficult was to make it work. How do you actually take ideas about improving people's well-being and using that as a guide for priority setting in government? And in the end, about 5 years ago or so, or maybe 10 years ago, it was scrapped entirely. So the Australian Treasury had developed it, started off very nicely, developed it, and then it was scrapped as being not a useful tool for helping them to make policy. The French in 2015 introduced a new act where a government has to set some indicators, some new wealth indicators they're called, and they have to announce these, and then every year in the budget cycle must talk about how those are developing, how policy is affecting these wealth indicators. And that was started off with a bang for the first year or two, and then almost immediately after that, it became just completely in abeyance, where they just ignore it, even though it's in the Act. So again, they found, I suspect it wasn't useful. I suspect the government found it troublesome in that the policies that they wanted to introduce did not show through in their wealth indicators that they'd had, and therefore didn't want to have to report against those wealth indicators. Wales is an example, I think, where they've had some quite innovative thinking, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And the nice thing about this is it applies to all public bodies in Wales at all levels. And it has two very nice features. One is that the Auditor General, or equivalent in Wales, can audit whether the public bodies are actually meeting their stated well-being goals. Every body has to state a well-being goal, and they have to then be audited for it. And there's also a Future Generations Commissioner, I can't remember the exact name, but something like that, who acts on behalf of future generations to say whether the policies that are being introduced are consistent with the well-being of future generations. And that's a very nice feature of the Welsh framework. United Arab Emirates has perhaps the most beautifully worked out conceptual approach to well-being analysis. They use the subjective well-being approach plus a little bit of the capabilities approach and use cost well-being analysis, use of, for instance, Wellbees. But this is set in a country which has absolutely appalling human rights. And so we have this extraordinary paradox of perhaps the most elegant well-being framework in a country with appalling human rights. So I'll just leave you that to ponder. And finally, in New Zealand, as I mentioned, we have the Living Standards Framework dashboard approach of Treasury, but this has not helped in terms of prioritisation of policies because there's no way of saying which of those domains or which policies affecting those domains and capitals should be prioritised. So this is the difficulty with some of these dashboard approaches. So let me just give you a couple of examples of how well-being, given these difficulties, how well-being might be used as a guide for policy. And the first, I'll take these two examples from New Zealand, from work that I've done here. And the first is trying to say, well, how could we make a dashboard approach such as the OECD's Better Life Framework or the New Zealand Treasury's Living Standard Framework? How can we maybe use that as a guide for policy? And what we have done here, this is work with Leah Haynes. With Leah, we've said, well, let's not treat all of these 12 domains of well-being the same as they are in the Living Standards Framework. Let's put subjective well-being at the top, people's overall rating of their lives, and think about the other 11 domains as contributing to that overall feeling of how people rate their lives. And what we did is we took a particular group of people, in this case, mothers who have dependent children who are living in hardship, essentially the bottom quartile on material well-being. And we said, which of the 11 other domains of well-being contribute most or associated most strongly with the overall subjective well-being of these mothers? And we used the General Social Survey data to estimate which are the most important domains for this particular group of people. And that's important because the weightings that one puts on these different features are going to be different depending on people's life circumstances. Again, that sort of comes back to a difficulty of having a top-down approach which says these are particular, things that are important for everyone. They're not. Different people have different priorities. And what we found is that for this group of mothers with dependent children in hardship, the most important domains for them were their knowledge and skills. And interestingly, this wasn't just education, this was actually their satisfaction with their knowledge and skills. So whether they actually thought that they had enough knowledge and skills. Also their income, their housing situation, their social connections, whether they were lonely, etc., their safety and their health. So these were the important domains that were associated with their overall life satisfaction. And interestingly, two relatively unimportant domains for them were ones that we often think from a top-down approach are very important: employment and environment. Employment is extremely important in the well-being literature, but when we break it down, it's actually extremely important for men and for some women, but it's not so important for other women. And you think about if you're a mother with dependent children and you're in hardship, the last thing you really want is to have to go out also and slave away at a low-paid job while trying to work out how to look after your children. And this is particularly the case we found, of course, with sole parents. And the environment is really a luxury good, although this is within the confines of New Zealand where virtually everyone enjoys a pleasant environment. So that's one way of saying, how can we prioritize areas that might be important for a particular group of people? The second one, bringing to the post-pandemic and pandemic side, is some recent work which I've been working on the effects of COVID lockdowns on well-being. And there are a number of studies internationally, one in the UK of when we should release the lockdown, which I think is reported in the BMJ, which refer to lockdowns as having a negative effect on well-being. So we used data that's been gathered by Statistics New Zealand, so very, very good surveys of people's well-being across New Zealand, both before the lockdown, which is the 2018 figures there, that was our most recent national survey of well-being, and then quarterly figures that our statistics agency introduced from June 2020 onwards using the same measures. And these are in our quarterly labour force survey. So large survey, well answered, and we can tell the overall subjective well-being and loneliness, etc., of people. And what we find is that actually going from pre-lockdown to lockdown, to the very first lockdown in the June quarter 2020, there was a massive increase in subjective well-being by 0.2. That's a very large change in a national overall life satisfaction scale. And so people seem to feel that the first lockdown they were being looked after by the government. And this is an example of the wellbeing policy in practice, I would argue, is that the government put the overall well-being, and in particular the health of people first, and GDP second. GDP fell by something like 11% that quarter. But people's overall health improved, and life expectancy actually improved, etc. And despite being in a very, very strict lockdown, the most strict lockdown of any OECD country. In the following quarter, the rest of New Zealand was out of lockdown, but Auckland went back into a lockdown. And the work that we have done separate from this graph shows that people in Auckland, relative to those in the rest of the country, did have a reduction in life satisfaction through their second lockdown of 0.2 of a point. So again, it's a pretty large reduction. It's similar sort of to the level of maybe becoming unemployed, or not quite as bad as that, but similar to that. And then post-lockdown, people's life satisfaction improved again. So this is an interesting example where we can actually test the effects of lockdowns using a subjective wellbeing approach to see whether the people affected by a lockdown, in this case Auckland in the second situation, had a reduction in subjective wellbeing, which they did. But even then, their overall wellbeing was higher than it was pre-lockdown. So there was a feeling that overall the government has been doing the right thing, but people are still negatively affected by lockdown. And if we look at loneliness as a separate indicator, we actually see that loneliness increased in each of the lockdowns, so right across the board. So that's another dimension. I've been talking mainly implicitly about the role of central government here, but of course local government has a hugely important role as well. And we have an act called the Local Government Community Wellbeing Act, which is actually modelled on the UK's act. And it says that a local government purpose is to promote the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of communities. And we know both from New Zealand and UK and elsewhere that subjective well-being in a country and other measures of well-being in a country vary very strongly across place. In Anglo-Saxon countries, at least, rural well-being tends to be higher than well-being in towns, which tends to be higher than well-being in large cities. And the importance about local government is that many of the things that affect our well-being are actually local government roles. The provision of community facilities, support for local culture and arts, etc., are often local government's role. And they're the people that are closest to the populace in terms of knowing what people want. And so there's a huge local government role in the well-being space. And it's one that's often overlooked, unfortunately, by central government. So just some final thoughts. I believe there are some promising approaches to policy that incorporate well-being, that are aimed at improving well-being. I find dashboards are very interesting indicators across a range of matters that affect well-being, but they don't show how we can prioritize policies, but they can illuminate which groups are not faring well on certain features of well-being. Subjective wellbeing offers a way forward, as we've seen in the UK's Green Book and New Zealand's Cost-Benefit Analysis Manual and other countries. It offers a way forward to understand what matters for people's welfare, taking people seriously, taking their own evaluations to account, rather than imposing our own evaluations on them. And we can use those results in cost wellbeing analysis. So I'll leave it there and stop sharing and invite the look forward to the commentaries of our other experts on the panel. Thank you.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Arthur. That was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed the way you covered everything from the intellectual foundations and broke it down, including a nice shout out to UCL there, which is always appreciated. And fascinating examples of both ways in which it has and has not worked and potential different ways in which it could be used. So really a great foundation. Thank you. So now, George, if you would like to share your slides.
Let me try to share. Okay. Can you see it?
Yep. Just need to
You
go
can see
full
my
screen.
slides, right?
You just need to go to full screen.
Okay. That okay?
Brilliant.
Okay, so thanks very much, Arthur, for this fascinating presentation and topic. I think I'm completely aligned with you on a lot of the points you've made, and I want to thank the Zangza and Michael and the DPU team for inviting me to be a discussant. It's a very fascinating and interesting topic. My comments are largely going to be based on some of the work happening within the bank, but also I will start by looking at some of the by looking at some of the slides you already mentioned about, and I think what you highlighted is the inadequacies of GDP. The underlying premises is that GDP is inadequate as a measure of measuring well-being, and because it focuses on economic and production function, and therefore there is a search for alternatives. And looking at some of the quotations, Stiglitz and David Cameron and so on, that underline the need and the search for alternatives. So I think I'm on you with that, on the inadequacies of GDP, and therefore the search for an alternative for measuring well-being and capturing this more comprehensively in the planning and budgeting processes in most countries. And I think there have been an attempt to complement the GDP, for example. You mentioned the OECD, so I don't want to highlight that again. But UNDP's Human Development Report, Human Development Index is an example to, either though that didn't look at the whole range of issues, it look at human development. And the World Bank recently, also in the last few years, have come up with what's called a Human Development Index, all trying to measure aspects of well-being that are not completely covered within the GDP. And so that underlies the points you were making. I would like to highlight some of these by looking at some of the fiscal measures that were adopted. And I think the pandemic has actually exposed the inadequacies of preparing a budget and planning a budget based on production and economic production and social production, which doesn't take care of pandemics and climate change and disaster risk and so on. So the bank has done some work. Our macroeconomic team has done some work looking at an overview of some of these fiscal measures to mitigate its economic and social impact of the pandemic. And I think there were a number of questions that countries were faced with during the pandemic: which policy to continue or maintain, which ones to cut or phase out, and then reallocate the funds in order to address the impact of the pandemic. In other words, countries have to tear down their budget and replan completely from the beginning. It was an emergency, and the bank was very much at the center of this. And so the countries we are supporting, I was based in Bangkok, Thailand, when this pandemic started, and covering a lot of South Asia and some of the East Asian countries. And I knew we had to prepare projects within a few months. Project that normally would take 12 months to prepare, we had to take 1 month. Staff were working overnight in 2 weeks to prepare a project that goes to the board. So that shows the inadequacy of the previous models we're using and be able to respond to the pandemic. Some of the objectives of fiscal policies adopted by governments, the overview shows that three main categories: one, to deal with the health pandemic and support the Ministries of Health to prepare them for their capacity and strengthen their institutions and capability to respond to the pandemic, to support households, things like households and individuals So cash transfers, for example, were an important part of that. To bolster businesses, and that will include loans and grants and so on, that were then became important for the private sector. And I think the pandemic had major impact on businesses, especially, for example, on the hospitality industry sector. The restaurants and small businesses were very much affected. And government pursued these objectives by using a whole range of instruments, including tax and expenditure measures, credits and loans and so on, to be able to address some of this. I mean, the report, I can share this report later with the ZACZA that was done by our macroeconomic team in the bank. And so a lot of the presentation is drawn on that. But there were certain common measures that were general across a lot of countries that they looked at. The loans and deferral of tax payments to businesses, cash transfer to individuals, supplementary and ad hoc programs that were introduced. So the pandemic, as I said, led to a lot of fiscal measures. And of course, the fiscal measures, some of these indicators, the measures were chosen, and maybe that is something I'll come back to you, Atta, in terms of how were the indicators selected for the well-being budgeting. What were the criteria, efficiency issues, cost and fiscal sustainability issues, flexibility issues, feasibility issues? So how did that inform the choice of indicators in the case of New Zealand? But I think these were some of the questions that were being asked when it came to selecting indicators and measures that to be taken during the pandemic. For example, cash transfers. How do you prevent abuse of the cash transfer system? How robust was the transfer system? And in countries like Bangladesh, they had to use the phone operators, the database of the phone operators, to do the cash transfer and use the mobile banking system so that it kind of prevented because these phones are registered, you know who owns the phone, and so it became easier to use them. And other countries also use that mobile banking, mobile transfer. Some like Kenya. In Kenya, the M-Pesa system was very useful. In Bhutan that you mentioned, there was a system in place, and the king's support to families used that system to distribute the benefits to families and communities. As a summary, this is just a summary of what they found across the countries they looked at: the quasi-fiscal activities, the guarantees, equities and loans, the non-health spending and revenue, the health spending revenue. I mean, things like the vaccines and the cold chains and preparing the health ministry to be able to respond to the pandemic. I think we're all quite important. So this is just a summary of that. And I think but looking across, there were variations in the magnitude and type of fiscal response across 3 country groups. So for example, for the advanced economies, 9% of the GDP in revenue and expenditure measures were used to support through equity and loans and guarantees and quasi-fiscal activities. Whereas in emerging markets and middle income economies, about 3 to 4% of GDP in expenditure and on all the instruments were used. And then for the low-income countries, the smallest fiscal response about 1.8% of GDP in expenditure and revenues. Now, that also indicates that the magnitude of response was based on the fiscal space available to countries and to governments, but it did not reduce the number of responses, but the magnitude of the response in terms of fiscal response, I think, was affected by the fiscal space available to countries. Now, so the pandemic actually showed the inadequacy of the the formal budgetary process, inadequacy to respond to things like emergencies and address well-being issues. Now, what I want, Arthur, maybe at the end, based on the work I've done earlier and some of the work I did earlier on my role in the bank as a manager of governance in a number of countries in Africa, but also in East and South Asia. One of the things I found very challenging in terms of is implementation. So I would like to hear more from you on the implementation side. What are the challenges in implementing the well-being budgeting in New Zealand, and what are the lessons we can draw for other countries? Because one size does not fix all, not fit all, and it's not easy. I mean, my experience in did my PhD on new public management and implementation of some of the reforms in the developing countries, and the challenge is implementation actually. So it would be good to hear from you what the challenges are, and some of these will be center of government. For example, in New Zealand, where does the coordination take place for the well-being budgeting? Either the center of government, the office of the Prime Minister, or the Ministry of Finance, or where? So it'd be good to know that. But that will also mean that for most of our countries, the center of government need to be reformed and strengthened to be able to do that. There are also capacities of the statistical agencies. I don't know about New Zealand. I mean, you will have a top-notch statistical agency, but most countries do not. And so moving to well-being will involve collecting data, analyzing data, to inform the planning and budgeting processes. In the bank, we've been supporting a number of countries to prepare projects, statistical projects to strengthen data collection, surveys, and so on. But I want to know from you how that works in the case of New Zealand. But it will mean moving to welfare budgeting, well-being budgeting. It will mean strengthening these agencies in most of the countries, middle-income countries, but also low-income countries. And then what will be the role of the ministries, departments, and agencies in the implementation of the welfare budgets, and their capacity to be able to prepare budgets according to the framework, I think will be one thing that you may also want to highlight. And because one thing I realized in countries I've worked in Africa, by 11 countries in Africa, and then East Asia like Malaysia and Thailand and the Philippines, is the capacity of the ministries to prepare budgets will vary. And how do you support them, especially if you are moving to the welfare budgeting? And then subnational governments, you did mention subnational governments. Their roles and capabilities will be quite important to highlight. How do you prepare them to prepare their budget? Because in some countries, the budget process is bottom up. You start from the subnational and they come to the national where they consolidate. So, and I know that from the work I've done in the bank as a manager, but also now as a lead governor especially, I know subnational governments are always the weakest link when it comes to planning and budgeting in some cases. There may be some federal countries like Nigeria and Brazil and so on, where some subnational governments are even much stronger than federal governments. But I think generally subnational governments are weaker when it comes to implementation and preparation of budget. I mean, there are countries like Rwanda who do very well in strengthening their subnational governments and preparation of budgets and monitoring. But we're going to hear from you on that as well. And then for non-state actors, private sector, NGOs, civil society, how they involve, not only in the planning process, but also in the budgeting process and the monitoring of the budget implementation. How are they involved in the case of New Zealand? But I think in terms thinking of implementation, all these aspects are quite important in terms of a multi-pronged approach and also a multi-stakeholder approach. If we're going to move to well-being, I think these are all going to be very important to look at. And this is elaborated in the SDG implementation and the challenges being faced by the implementation of SDGs in a number of countries are facing all these issues I've just mentioned. Now, and then the post-implementation reporting, accounting, auditing. How do you mentioned auditing, for example, how do you strengthen the capacity of Auditor General Office to be able to audit, or the Accountant General's Office to be able to report on budgeting and how ministries have spent their money, and the Auditor General to be able to audit. I know for some countries, even auditing subnational government become a challenge. There's not enough capacity to do that. And this was actually exposed during the pandemic when auditors could not go to the field to audit. So what happens when we have a situation like the pandemic happening? So moving to online and technology to do auditing without necessarily having to visit the field, I think it's going to be important going forward in the post-pandemic world going forward. But strengthening public financial management and moving more to electronic systems for preparing budgets and planning and auditing, I think is going to be important if we're going to move to welfare budgeting. I guess what this slide, I would want to highlight how climate change is being incorporated into the budgeting and planning and budgeting. These are some examples of indicators that for some of our colleagues in the governance practice supporting public financial management and planning and budgeting, these are some of the indicators they are looking at in incorporating this in our projects that we are supporting under governance practice. For example, in Bhutan, the climate budgeting tagging is being used. So to see ministries that have included climate change into their budgets. And in the bank, we have a target that to achieve about 35% climate co-benefits in all our projects on average. And so for each project you prepare, you need to show how much it is contributing to climate change. And it will vary, depends on the sector. So health, education, infrastructure, roads and bridges, especially the heavy infrastructure side will have more to contribute than say governance. In governance, we're looking at procurement. Now there is a lot of interest in green bonds and green procurement. So these are some of the things that are being incorporated into budgeting, planning, and also preparation of projects, for example, in the bank. And I know a lot of multilateral development banks also have targets when it comes to the climate. So these are things to think about in the post-pandemic world, where you incorporate climate change into the planning and budgeting process. Now, from my side, I think I agree with you, Arthur, in a lot of the points you've made, that all the SDGs and the Human Development Index and Human Capital and all show the inadequacies of the capital income and GDP. But the search for alternatives also means that we need to be aware of the implementation capacity where these policies are going to be implemented. I think it is easier to come up with frameworks, but implementation is always a challenge. And so my sense is that one size does not fit all, but I like the idea of the dashboard approach where countries can select which indicators work for them and which indicators they can prioritize. Because for countries that are prone to hurricanes, for example, some of the Caribbean countries, parts of the US, climate change may be prominent in their budget planning and budgeting. For those that are subject to other natural disasters like earthquakes, landslides, parts of the Himalayas and Nepal and so on, that will be important. And also for island countries in the Caribbean and for example, Maldives, they will factor in climate change more into their budget and so on. So I think the continuous build of institutional and human capacity for implementation is going to be necessary, but also flexibility in the framework to allow countries to choose which indicator they include in their budget is going to be important. But that also means that, I mean, a lot of development agencies, the bank, the OECD, the European Union also need to be flexible so that they don't come with very rigid frameworks and say, you must apply this before we support you. Working in the bank and having already before also done my work before joining the bank, I know it is always sometimes difficult when we come and support the government. We may come with a framework to say, well, you need to reform your country according to ABCD, when we don't know the capacity to implement. I think assessing the capacity to implement is going to be important. So let me just stop here with some questions, and Arthur, you can respond to some of them, but also we can open it for discussion, but maybe drawing more on your New Zealand experience to highlight a bit more on the capacity to implement side, particularly the role of ministries, departments, and agencies, the role of local government. But a broader question for all of us is, looking at the post-pandemic planning and budgeting, what do you think is going to remain? What do we learn from the pandemic that will remain as part of our budgeting and planning process? What is going to be ditched? I think we're going to face challenges about, there are certain practices that may continue. For example, I don't see the bank, we've been talking about hybrid mode. People are not going to completely return to the office. We may do 3 days in the office and 2 days at home. That flexibility is going to continue in most organizations in most countries. Also, I think that climate change is so important. The pandemic is so important. So pandemic planning and preparedness, I think, will remain, but going forward will remain a bigger part of the budgeting process. So let me just stop here and then maybe hand over to Saksa.
Thank you so much, George. You've really zeroed in on a lot of really critical themes and elements there, and I think set us on a great path for the discussion. Arthur, you're probably itching to answer many different angles of that. Can I suggest that you take a few moments to pick up a few of them, and then we'll open it up to the Q&A, and hopefully we can circle back on these themes and answer them more fully through the discussion.
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks, George. A fascinating set of comments. You've raised a lot of points. So let me just focus, first of all, at this stage, before we have the wider comments, on the capacity to implement, because I think that's a really important issue that you raised. I think we would have to say this is widely variable in the New Zealand public sector, both central and local government. And if I can take the pandemic as an example, one of the real successes, I think there were two real successes in New Zealand. One was very early comprehensive lockdown, which gave us the chance to live our lives for many months after that, or even almost 2 years after that, without any pandemic affecting us. So essentially our lives were completely normal until the last couple of weeks for most of us, apart from perhaps in Auckland. So that was one success, and that you can't do consultation on that. That was just something that had to be a top-down approach done virtually immediately from the centre. The other area that was done from the centre almost immediately in conjunction with the lockdown, which I think was a real strength of implementation, was that we had an extraordinarily wide-ranging wage subsidy, which everyone could just apply for and get. It went through the firms, and provided they kept their employees on board, they received a wage subsidy, which essentially kept full employment right through the pandemic period. And there was no, it was virtually, you got it within 2 or 3 days of applying. So there was no stand down period or anything like that. It just happened. And then there was post auditing to check that people had done it within the law. And a number of large corporates, for instance, subsequently discovered that they perhaps didn't qualify and paid back before they were audited, but they applied immediately and got it. That was a real success story in terms of keeping full employment. So I think the implementation that side has been great. Interestingly, our Ministry of Health has had a lot of expertise on the health side, but have been very slow to implement and prejudge issues such as how to test, how to order vaccines, how to think about all sorts of other things that other countries were thinking about, but was very slow in implementing because they were a policy agency, not an implementation agency. And we had this thing, new public management reforms, George, you're an expert on this, where we separated operations and policy. So we had sort of policy shops, ministries, and then we had operational departments. That has been, in my view, pretty much a complete lack of success. Rather than having departments that are joined up that are both policy and operational, the split meant that our policy shops didn't know how to implement and didn't know how to think about implementation when they were coming up with policy. So I think the policy operational split in public management has not been a success, and that's been shown in some of our situations in New Zealand. I'll leave it at that for now because you've raised so many points, but I think we can come back to many of them after we've had some other discussions.
That's fantastic. Adrian, would you be able to take the step there and start our Q&A?
Well, thank you. In advance, I had so many questions that I thought that they could be a topic in their own right. But many of them have been answered, and I guess, you know, like I zeroed in on the same question that you did, George, around implementation. But I think like going beyond implementation in the sense of planning for budgeting and designing policy, and switching the focus to the other end of the spectrum, which is the people who are the recipients, our populations of government policies as results of a wellbeing approach to budgeting. And I'm thinking of the Carnegie UK Trust test of successful wellbeing. And I'm quoting, "Wellbeing cannot be done to people. It has to be done by and with them." And I think a huge capacity question, George, extending from your discourse, is how is the capacity of our public agencies to successfully engage with people and bring them into the wellbeing framework. And it's like anything, you know, we've got many examples and long histories of policies being done to people that end up being, well, fizzling out really, because you have to have take up, putting it another way, at the end of the people who benefit or not from the policies and the budget allocations that emerge from our government machinery. So I'm wondering whether both of you might comment on that whole question of community engagement and beyond the surveys that subjective wellbeing approaches rely on.
Thanks, Adrian. Can I come in straight away on that one, Jaja? Because I think Adrian's raised a really important point, and I want to put it in the context of New Zealand society, where between 15 and 20% of our population is Maori, which is the indigenous population, and another 5 to 7% or so Pacifica, people from the Pacific Islands who are here. So over 20% of the population. What we found through the pandemic, and in particular with the vaccination rollout, which is now very, very high, one of the highest in the world, but for a long time, our Maori population in particular lagged well behind the rest of the population in terms of vaccination rates. This is despite the fact that in the 1918-20 flu epidemic, Maori mortality rate was far higher. This is well known by Maori. It was also the case with the Pacific Island population, but actually for various reasons, their vaccination rates came up faster this time. But actually the reason why the Pacific Island community vaccination rate came up fast was because, and the Maori population didn't, is because we started off by just having a national rollout of vaccinations. Everyone could turn up at their chemist or their doctors or whatever like that and get vaccinated. And it was the same media that went to everybody. But different groups of the population see different media. They understand things differently. They have different values. And it was only when we started working through the Pacific Island churches that we managed to get the Pacific Island vaccination rate up, because the ministers, the pastors, etc., in the Pacific Island community, particularly in Auckland, are the community leaders, and it relied on those leaders basically saying to their congregations, you need to get vaccinated to have success. The general campaign through it didn't matter whether it was social media or traditional media, was unsuccessful in getting to that group. But as soon as their leaders got to that group, it made a huge difference in Pacific Island vaccination rates. With Maori, our Ministry of Health refused to release data on Maori vaccination take-up to Maori health agencies that were on the ground, that were local. And that was done because of privacy issues, and I can understand the legal impediments that they faced. But the fact was that the people on the ground, the Maori health providers on the ground, who needed to be the people who to get to the local population and convince them face to face that this was a worthwhile thing, didn't have the information to go by. So we denied the people on the ground the ability to implement a vaccination policy to that group. And as a result, the Maori vaccination rate stayed extremely low for a long time, and in particular amongst the most disadvantaged Maori communities. So this was an example, I think, where implementation has to not be done on a national level. It has to be done both on a regional level, but in particular at a population group level, where we need to understand that different population groups react to central government in different ways. I mean, today my office is blocked off because my office is opposite Parliament. We have a sort of ragtag group of people protesting outside Parliament, like in Canada, and these are people on the margins of society. These aren't the you know, the industry leaders. These are the people you just have to look at them to see they're on the margins of society. These are the people who have been left out of the mainstream ways of getting to people. And so from an implementation point of view, we've got to think how to get different population groups.
And if I might just chip in again there, thank you, George, for raising the question of the role of the NGO sector. I think one of the experiences, one of the cultural aspects of our public service in New Zealand is not sufficiently trusting the NGOs, and the whole thing around Māori vaccination is probably a parallel, where you really need to go to quite a specific level of whānau, as we describe extended families for Māori in New Zealand, and where they live, if you want your policy to be successful. Otherwise, you end up with this yawning gap between what government is wishing to roll out, and as I say, how individual people and groups of people and communities react to it. And that's where you get policy failure very often. However elegant your policies and however rigorous your budget allocations may be.
Curious to push you all further on the side of the policy input as well as the kind of response to, but I'm conscious of the time, and so George, I'm sure you have some comments that you'd like to make there as well, and then we'll bring in Lee-Yin, and we've got questions from the audience as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sasha. On the policy input side, as I did mention, a number of countries are implementing what we call participatory budgeting, where actually budgeting and planning start at the local government and community level. I mean, example is Kenya, where in Kenya, the constitution actually mandates that you start your planning and budgeting at that level. And then communities will have to, when you finish preparing the budget, you have to share with them for comment, you have to have a forum where you discuss all this. And then before it goes to, and when I was based in Kenya for about almost 4 years, and then I've seen cases people going to court to challenge the budget because it wasn't shared with them. It wasn't, those community forums did not take place, and they go and challenge that the budget has not gone through that process, and therefore the state assembly or the county assembly should not approve the budget. So participatory budgeting has been used in a number of countries to get input of citizens and communities into preparation of the budget. It hasn't worked in all countries, but at least in some countries it's been working in terms of planning and the budgeting. But also auditing, for example, in Nepal, we call citizens audit has been introduced, where the Auditor General actually go to community to share audit reports with them, also get their input into the audit report. So it's also been introduced in a few countries. So let me, on the input side, I think that's what I was saying. And some countries like Nepal and have significantly decentralized in such a way that local government and communities actually have a lot of say in the planning and budgeting processes. But it doesn't work in all countries. In some countries, just a form rather than a function of it. So there's a difference between the form and the function in most places, but in a few countries, actually, it does work.
Great. Leanne, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Hi, I really want to thank my colleagues, Michael and Shasha, for organizing this webinar. I think it has provided a fantastic opportunity for us to reflect on this very important topic, which is well-being. Now, I came to the concept of well-being actually through the work of Amartya Sen. And I must confess that I was a bit frustrated by the rather abstract approach. Well, that's my impression of it at the time, to this issue. So today, from Asen's presentation, I felt that it has opened my eyes to real practices, you know, in the policy field. I was particularly interested to look at the 6 countries' experience in implementing well-being policies, because it gives you a real sense of what has been tried. At the same time, though, I must confess that these collection of experiences did not inspire confidence in me in the well-being policy approach, I'm afraid. And so the first question I have for us is that what is your estimation of the potential of this kind of approach in the future? And do you think that the pandemic has increased this potential, enlarged this potential or not? And if yes, why? And if no, why not? And in fact, I also find as your slide on the well-being measurements in New Zealand before and after the first lockdown and the second lockdown rather puzzling, but also extremely interesting, because it suggests that the first lockdown actually enhanced well-being, subjective well-being, but the second did the opposite. So I wonder whether you are able to shed further light on the possible underlying rationale for this. Is there a logical explanation? Is it because the first lockdown enabled people to go back family and be closer to their people, and therefore enhanced their well-being? But the second lockdown may feel rather like a suppression, and people had a different feel about the whole thing. So that is my first question. And then the second question relates to a different kind of issues. When Stiglitz and others published their 2009 report, the accent of the message was that we must not only look at objective well-being measurements. We should look at both the objective and the subjective. Well, in reality and among student bodies, I know that the message they get is that economic development indicators perhaps do not matter so much anymore. So they've been questioning the value of conventional economic indicators such as GDP per person. Now, from today's event, and actually I took advantage of the information you shared, Asa, and looked through some of the report, the World Happiness Report, one very interesting feature really struck me is how consistently actually subjective well-being measurement is predicted by economic indicators, such as per capita GDP. And it was even more interesting from George's presentation to note, the percentage of fiscal expenses spent on tackling the pandemic is actually systematic with the income level of the different countries. And once again, this then both sets of evidence would seem to suggest to me that rather than, when we we were promised that by looking into, subjective well-being, we have really found something to tackle, to attack, which is economic objective well-being measurement. But now we suddenly find ourselves actually in a quite different world, where we actually found real evidence and consistent evidence that economic indicator, objective well-being indicators, is a very good predictor of subjective well-being. So I wonder, what is your view on this issue? And I would be really interested in hear your assessment of this relationship between objective and subjective well-being. So that's my two questions, a bit long.
Okay, well, there were already 3 questions in there because you started off with my confidence in this approach as to how it would work. I have confidence that the well-being approach, especially a subjective well-being approach, can really assist us in at the micro level in terms of policy, comparing policies, seeing whether policies are worthwhile, because they definitely take into account the non-material aspects of policies, which cost-benefit analysis always should have done, but often didn't do very adequately. And now we have tools such as the Wellbeing approach that's in the Green Book, etc., in the UK, that assist us in bringing well-being in a more systematic way. So I have confidence at that level, not so much at these grand national level sort of statements. The second one you asked about the lockdowns. My interpretation of our data is that people felt that the government's overall looking after people's health was a real plus and led to the large increase. And this went across virtually every population group. I've divided this into 32 population groups by ethnicity, by region, by parental status, etc. Every one of those 32 groups either stayed the same or went up in terms of their overall subjective well-being with the first lockdown. And I think it was because here was a genuine sort of sign that a government was looking after people's health in a crisis situation, and that led to people improving their well-being. After that, then the strain of extra lockdowns, the Auckland one, which I mentioned, and of course we've had one since then feels like it's, this again. And that's where we can actually measure that continued lockdowns are probably deleterious for people's well-being, for those who are affected. Of course, those who weren't affected by these extra lockdowns certainly enjoyed it, because the Aucklanders up north had to go through a lockdown for our benefit. So there's a regional component there. I should also mention that trust in government, trust in police, trust in every other institution went up with the first lockdown. So this was a really strong social capital contribution, but then the one area that went down was that where they got worse was loneliness. Okay, but I think it was loneliness with a cause. To think of the old film, the people felt that they were being lonely, but it was for the national good, and people didn't mind being lonely for a certain amount of time. But of course, loneliness we know is one of the longer-term predictors of poor subjective well-being. In terms of the relationship between subjective and objective well-being, I would just back up what you've said. Rich countries are happier than poorer countries on average. Rich people are happier than poorer people on average. There is no doubt that economic development is a huge positive contributor to well-being. So what this well-being agenda, I think, is saying is not to replace economic development as being incredibly important. It's to supplement it with other factors. If we look at the top 20 countries in terms of average well-being of a country, the only one that's not a rich country is Costa Rica, Why is Costa Rica in there? It's a middle income country. It has a thriving democracy, wonderful environment, terrific family social life. And we know that social relations are incredibly important for well-being. So it's got just about everything right, even though it's not a really rich country. It's a middle income country. Every other country in that top 20 are rich countries. But if you look also at the US, it's well down that list of 20 compared with countries which have much more thriving social democracies and social support systems. So economic development is very important, but it's not the only thing.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
If I may, Sankha, on the just a quick comment on trust. It's interesting to note that in New Zealand, trust went up. For us, in most countries, the evidence is that trust went down during the pandemic. Trust in government and public institutions actually went down during the pandemic in most of the countries that we've been looking at. So maybe New Zealand will be slightly on the different, but the average trust globally actually went down in most countries during this pandemic. Sure. And that also goes for, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, that poverty and inequality has increased during this pandemic. And I think the question will be, for the post-pandemic world, how do we address those? The inequality gap has widened, poverty has increased for the bottom 20%, and also trust has gone down in most countries. So how do you prepare a post-pandemic planning and budgeting to build back and regain some of the things that have been lost during this? These are very important governance and institutional questions that need to be addressed by governments to regain the confidence of citizens in most countries that we work with. Thanks.
Can I just come in on that? Because I know we're running out of time, Shasha, but I think that was one of the successes of our early pandemic response, was that the wage subsidy guaranteed essentially the job of virtually everyone, not guaranteed the job, but made sure that firms could continue to pay people in employment. So we didn't get the unemployment spike that some countries had. Benefits actually went up, minimum wage went up, surprisingly, through a pandemic. So we really looked after the lower end of people in terms of those who suffer in terms of material well-being very strongly. And I think that has to be a lesson of well-being policies, is that you have to look after the people at the lower end and really prioritize that end to ensure that an overall well-being policy can succeed.
This is such a fascinating discussion, and I'm so hesitant to intervene here, in particular because we also have a fantastic question in the audience from Jeffrey Payne about whether there are some measures that can be applied universally and whether others should be more locally contextual. I think we're going to have to see this as the beginning of an ongoing conversation rather than the end of this conversation, because we are out of time. And I would just like to hand over to Michael to finish up, but just for myself to quickly say thank you so much for everybody's participation in this. It has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Michael.
Thanks. I mean, if we do have a couple of minutes, we also have a question from Anna Kerno about if, given well-being statistics, why there's been a surge in social unrest and conspiracy theorizing. So both interesting questions. I mean, if we do have a couple more minutes to go, I wonder whether we could get just very, very brief answers to, I'm not sure Jeff Payne's question about key indicators is easy to answer quickly, but it's a very important one about whether there are ways of being able to compare well-being across countries while also retaining some kind of sense of what local context means. But maybe, and I'm sorry, Anna and Jeff, if I am summarizing these in an inappropriate way, but maybe could we have 2 minutes from each of you on comparisons and local context and why you think there's been a surge in social unrest?
Well, can I just come to Jeff, the question first? I look at the subjective well-being life satisfaction statistic as being the overall sort of single best statistic of how a country is doing. You just saw the 8 countries that you have the highest rates and you think, yeah, these are pretty good countries to live in. I think it's a good statistic overall, and especially changes in it. when you see big changes, or you see changes in that, you know that something is happening. These are well sampled. And then I think you have to go in at the local level. And in New Zealand's case, for instance, we have to break it down by ethnicity. In other countries, you may break it down by region, as in North and South England or something like that. So I think you do have to then get down to the local level to get your indicators. On the other question on conspiracy theories, etc. Look, that's well outside my area of expertise. I'm afraid I'll have to look it up on social media and see what people say on there.
Yeah, I think on the indicators, I will agree with Arthur on that. I mean, we look at the SDGs, we look at, for example, the UNDP Human Development Index. You can do it both at the national level and the sub-national level, but then what is compared is the macro level. The aggregate level at the macro level that can be, we compare one country to the other, but more on the subnational level, I think that we can compare different subnationals. For example, in Nigeria, I compare different states, or in Brazil, we compare different states. But to be able to compare one country to the other, we need to have some universal standard indicators that are comparable across countries, some uniform ones that are compared across countries. On the other question, I mean, it is linked to the whole issue, the whole issue of trust that I raised, trust and accountability, and what the pandemic has done to that in most countries where trust has gone down and people's accountability for government. And I think there's another bigger issue about how the pandemic has actually given room for some central government to impose some, and it makes some governments more autocratic, really. And in some of the countries that are not, I mean, even where they are democratic, they become a bit more autocratic in the rules that were imposed. So it is linked to that trust and accountability issue, but also groups, extreme groups have taken advantage of this as well. And how do you rein in these extreme groups in some of the countries? And I think that is something that, again, various countries, they will do in different ways based on their capacity. But I think the issue of trust and accountability of government is an issue that is feeding in some of this unrest and in most countries. Let me stop there.
Thank you, George. Thank you to both of you and to all of the panelists. It's been really fantastic. And I'm always really excited to have the chance to sort of, well, actually, if I'm speaking honestly, to bring New Zealand into a discussion about, I guess, the areas that we usually work in, and DPU are not New Zealand, and it's my home country. So it's wonderful to get a chance to sort of think about how we can not necessarily compare, but somehow learn from each other, because I think that there is actually quite a lot of learning that can happen across the sort of usual divisions of North and South. It was really great to have Professor Grimes's overview of approaches, Dr. Labi's response, including particularly the challenges faced by low-income countries, which I think, I mean, that issue of the sort of clear, it's not consistent, but nevertheless overall quite clear complementarity between objective well-being and subjective well-being is striking, but also it's striking, for example, as you said, Arthur, that the US is well down that list. So it's not wealth alone that is the predictor of subjective well-being. So there's something interesting in there, but also something very challenging, given that objective well-being, if it is based on a kind of understanding of economic growth, has huge implications for our sort of concerns with climate change and sustainability and so on. So there are huge challenges there to try and think about. George, I was taken by your comment that it's easier to come up with frameworks, but implementation is always a challenge. That's certainly my experience. And I guess we need to keep talking. And I hope this is the start of a much longer conversation. I know people are needing to go. It's the end of the whole event, but I do just want to end by drawing your attention to some of the bits of what I hope is part of the same conversation, maybe in some ways coming up. These are some of the events on the diary in the next few weeks. We have more in the post-pandemic planning in the South series, which is this series, but we have no more events confirmed on dates that I can announce at the moment. So you'll need to look out in your emails for the dates there. But we do have a few. There's a book launch on African demography from Edward Pace, who has spent the last couple of years writing it. And I know how much time and effort he's put into it. I've read the book. It's fantastic. It's really interesting. That'll be a really interesting event. 3rd of March, it'll be an in-person and online thing. The in-person bit will be at Senate House if you're in London. So come up. We're at room, 403. UN Habitat Executive Director Maimouna Mold-Sharif is speaking to DPU. We've got a big room for that. So if you're in London, please come. We'll try and stream it, but that's on the 14th of March. It should be really interesting to hear her vision for where she sees sustainable human settlements and planning going. And there's another book launch there from our very own Professor Lian Zhang, who you just heard from a moment ago, talking about conducting and financing low carbon transitions in China. There is a huge amount there. And a huge amount in this talk this evening to ponder. So a big thank you to Arthur, to George, and to all of the panelists for a really fascinating discussion. There's never enough time for these things. There never will be. So I hope that this is a conversation that we are able to take forward, continue in the future. So thank you to everyone, and thank you to everyone for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
See you soon.
Thank you for hosting that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Arthur.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Alex.
Thanks for getting up early.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
Like it.
A brilliant event. And as I said in the chat room, it just opens up. The more you talk about these things, the more it opens up about what you want to be talking about and topics for future events. You have a never-ending stream ahead of you.
We do. That was only the next few weeks. So there is a lot more to come. Okay, well, thanks everyone, and see you all soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Okay.